Captain Peter Cutzy in South Korea, and this is my briefing room. Today we're going to cover the last part in the series of the three-part checklist: engine fire, severe damage, or separation. Today, separation. We're going to go into the checklist later. We'll just start the PowerPoint on how do we identify. So we're assuming in this briefing again that this happened right after V1 on rotation, and the pilot flying will experience a massive and rapid yaw as the engine tears away from the airplane, fly the airplane. In any case, just to identify what it looks like, the N1 would be 0, as we see here. EGT would indicate engine fail. N2, 0. And fuel flow, blank. Oil pressure, blank. Oil temperature, blank. Oil quantity, blank. And vibrations, 0. In addition, the fault light on the pedestal on the engine overheat and fire panel, that fault light will be on. So this is how you identify the problem. So the appropriate actions, of course, immediately when it happens, it's the pilot flying will fly the airplane, and pilot monitoring will monitor the pilot flying. Pilot monitoring, think of yourself as the pilot flying in standby. Years ago, we called the pilot monitoring pilot not flying, and we thought that was rather inappropriate, and I agree. Then we changed it to pilot monitoring, which is much more appropriate. However, if you went one step further, to think that you're not only monitoring as a pilot monitoring, but you're ready to take over control. Therefore, I would like to think of the expression, the pilot monitoring, as really the pilot flying in standby. When the gear is up and at a safe altitude, a minimum of 400 feet is what you're going to do before you really get involved in doing anything. So, as we mentioned in previous briefings, I break down the layers of thinking into a red layer, amber layer, green layer, and a blue layer. The red layer is between liftoff and 400 feet above field elevation. Fly the airplane. Use rudder inputs to keep the aircraft straight in this case. Use, by that I mean you won't have a fire bell. Use rudder pedal inputs to keep the aircraft straight. And you're going to need a lot of rudder because the yaw is going to be excessive. Enough rudder to keep the control wheel level, the way you see in this picture, and the turn slip indicator, the way you see it here. Rotate it 1.5 to 2.5 degrees per second to a pitch reference of 12.5 degrees, 12 to 13. Then follow the command bars. Track the center line of the runway. Use rudder trim when under control. Don't rush to use the rudder trim. When you're more experienced on the airplane, you will be able to put your hand down without looking. You want to practice that when you're on the ground at the gate. And remember that moving the rudder trim knob to the full extent will give you a rate of 1 unit every 2 seconds. And that's good to know because you're not looking down and you don't want to look down. And for an engine separation, whatever it takes, but you'll find somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 units later. But don't look at that. The amount of rudder trim that you use at any time is enough for the situation. So I don't like to give you numbers, but that number is something approximate. Okay, it'll vary depending on the thrust and the weight and many other variables. In any case, you can practice that little technique. Engage in autopilot, of course, not below 400 feet, but when you're comfortable. And I say that because it's important, and I've mentioned that in previous briefings, that it's important that you have the airplane fully under control, and that's what I mean about when you're comfortable. Technique, engine malfunction 1, engage autopilot B, and if the malfunction is on engine number 2, then engage autopilot A. Here we are with the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring, or the pilot flying is flying the airplane, rotating it the way we said, and approximately 5 seconds by the time you reach 12.5 degrees of pitch. Remember, as you go through 10 degrees of pitch on the 737, there's a dead band, and you'll have to increase the back pressure in order to maintain that rate. Otherwise, you'll stop at 10 degrees, and that's not good. Your instructor will mention that to you. You'll probably see that, or maybe even experienced it when you're in the simulator. In any case, I suggest that pilot monitoring call engine malfunction. You're not sure at this point, really, and you don't want to jump into giving the wrong information. So I'm making a suggestion that you call engine malfunction, which it is, and later on you will identify when you're above 400 feet. Okay. Once the pilot flying has reached the 12.5 degrees of pitch, use the command bars. When the pilot monitoring observes a positive rate of climb on the baro altimeter, don't give it on the radio altimeter or the IVSI. Those two will be moving first. The baro altimeter probably will move last, and that's the one you use. Positive rate. Pilot flying, after checking a positive rate on the baro altimeter, she or he will call gear up. So if you notice, nothing is said basically, and nothing is really communicated between pilots until 400 feet. Everyone is focused on the fact that the pilot flying is flying the airplane properly. Okay. And by the way, don't say anything about the engine if you're not sure. Even don't say engine malfunction unless you're sure. Better to say nothing until 400 feet. That's safer. Pilot monitoring. Place the gear lever to the up position. When the gear lights are extinguished, place the landing gear lever to the off position. That's on the NG only. Pilot flying, track the center line like this. And we've talked about this before. The white solid line is your track line as generated by the IRS. The white dashed line that extends 14.2 nautical miles from the threshold of the runway is the center line. So if you keep the white solid line, the track line, over the white dash line, you will be tracking the center line of the runway, providing your map is accurate. Well, you know your map is accurate because when you touch toga on the runway, you checked your map. You're not just looking at 40% on the N2, you're looking at the nav display to make sure your map is correct. Okay, here's a look at your pitch reference at 12.5 degrees of pitch. Okay. As we approach the amber zone, which is 400 feet to 800 feet, And let's say in this case, you're flying straight ahead, basically two calls, heading cell and identify. This is the pilot flying. And don't make those calls, pilot flying, unless you are actually safely under control. That is, you're not off the center line and your speed and pitch is correct. Speed V2 to V2 plus 20. All right, with an engine out. So we'll look at one more item in the amber zone. The other scenario in the amber zone between 400 and 800 feet above field elevation is if your company has actually created an engine out procedure that you're going to follow. Then you would have four calls as pilot flying at 400 feet, would be heading cells at bank limit 15 degrees, open the speed window and identify. I like to think in numbers. So generally, if it's straight ahead, just two calls, heading cell and identify. And if there's a turn involved between 400 and 800 feet or whatever, and then heading cell, set bank limit 15, open the speed window and identify. In any case, if your company SOPs dictate that you will always set the bank limit to 15 degrees, regardless of whether it's straight ahead or not, then you follow your company SOPs. Okay, let's go to the identification. The engine separation, you probably will have abnormal airframe vibrations, and certainly abnormal engine indications. Primary readings are here, 0 on N1 and engine fail on the EGT. And a blank reading, as you can see here. And then the other indications are all blank, except the N1 and vibrations are 0. In addition, on the fire panel on the pedestal, you have a fault light illuminated. All of these indicate a separation. Engine number 2, separation. That's from the pilot monitoring, after she or he has fully identified it. All right, so here we are again in the duties and the call by the pilot flying, as we mentioned, and the call from the pilot monitoring, engine separation number 2. Pilot flying, disengage the auto throttle with hand on number 2 thrust lever. Engine number 2 thrust lever, confirm? It's a question. After confirming engine number 2, pilot monitoring, confirm number 2. Pilot flying, engine number 2 thrust lever, retard slowly until the thrust lever is closed. Pilot monitoring, monitor the pilot flying. Pilot monitoring then places her or his hand on number 2 engine start lever and says, engine number 2 start lever? Question. Pilot flying confirms the selection is correct and says, confirm number 2. The pilot monitoring selects the respective start lever to cutoff, stating cutoff. Pilot monitoring then places her or his hand on number 2 engine fire switch and says, engine number 2 fire switch. Pilot flying confirms the selection is correct and says, confirm number 2. A little note here I've added is when, as pilot monitoring, you place your hand not over the fire switch lights, but under the fire switch lights, so that the pilot flying can actually see that there's no fire, but that you actually have selected the correct fire switch. Okay. Before selecting the switch release, because remember, there are no lights illuminated in the fire switch. And the lights illuminated would actually release the fire switch so that when you pull the switch, it would move. But because there are no lights, and from your ground spool, you can remember that you're actually going to have to select the release, fire switch release underneath. So the pilot monitoring selects the respective fire switch release under the fire switch, and as she or he is pulling the switch, says, pull. Now we're entering the green zone between 800 feet above field elevation and MSA. As we talked before, track the center line still, unless you're in a turn. We discussed that already. Now your command bars at that point should pitch down. If you're in VNAV with FMCU 10.7 or greater, they'll pitch down to command you to increase your speed so you can clean up the airplane. So clean up the airplane on schedule. And when the flaps are up and the lights are out, level change and MCT. So the call is level change or MCT or whatever your SOP state. You may be in VNAV and your company may want you to stay in VNAV if in fact the speed is where it should be. That is the speed bug has moved, speed bug has moved to flaps up speed. Here again, you're still flying the airplane, maintaining the slip indicator the way you see it here. You're still in the aviate mode. Remember, aviate, navigate, communicate. You're still aviating at 800 feet. You're in the green zone, just what we called about. We talked about that. So this is all split up to who does what. All right. Now remember that when pilot flying is ready to select an autopilot, they make the selection. The pilot flying makes that selection. The little note I put here is Boeing recommend that the pilot flying make MCP inputs when the autopilot is engaged. And your company probably follow that same procedure in their SOPs. But one thing I want you to be careful with is even though your autopilot is engaged, you may still be struggling with the aircraft. And if you are, remember your focus as pilot flying is fly the airplane, not touch the MCP. The moment you start touching the MCP and searching, you've taken your eyes away from the flying of the airplane, and that could be disastrous. So please use airmanship. Ask the pilot monitoring to make the selection for you. You've got an FMA. Everything you need is on your primary flight display. Everything you need is on your PFD. You don't need anything else. So you can ask the pilot monitoring to make selections for you, and you will see them enunciated in accordance with that on your FMA. Okay, indications. All right, let's move on. When the flaps are fully up, as we mentioned before, level change, MCT. Those are the two calls. If you're continuing en route, make sure that you call for the engine out climb page. That's the pilot flying will make that call. And climb at the engine out speed and climb to the engine out altitude. Now, the engine out page on the CDU should be there automatically. In any case, make sure that you do follow what it's saying if you're going en route. Pilot monitoring will do what you're asking, okay? Now, you may have a route to your alternate and route to takeoff alternate, whatever. If you can't come back and land, or you don't want to come back and land because of whatever reasons that you discussed in your takeoff briefing, then you're going to go off to either your destination if it's close or whatever. But if you're going en route, make sure you do these three items here. Okay. Now we're getting into the navigate portion. Everything up to this point was AV8. Now, when you're navigating, you're still aviating, but it's the navigation portion. You're turning. You may be turning between 400 feet and 800 feet, or you may be turning at 1,500 feet, which is standard. or whatever. But whenever you start the turn to go to a point to hold, if you're not going to go en route, then make sure you ask the pilot monitoring what you want, and you fly the airplane. You're in a heading cell mode at this point. Remember, it's important. And remember that you're in the green zone, you're not in the blue zone, you're not at MSA yet, so you're still restricted to 15 degrees of bank. Remember, only when you're in the blue zone can you increase the bank. And of course, you won't be able to increase the bank unless you tell the pilot monitoring to select the bank selector to the auto position, or return it to the auto position. If you have already asked for set bank limit to 15 degrees, auto, and then you'll be able to get your 28 degrees of bank, what you normally get. All right. So I mentioned that here. And so let's go to the next. And now you're in the blue zone. Blue zone, MSA and above, safe to increase bank, safe to communicate to a little more detail. Remember, communicate is basically 3 different parts to your communication. You communicate with your controlling agency as soon as you can when it's safe. You don't want to be talking about an engine problem at 100 feet to anybody. So with experience, you'll realize when you can say something very short to tower or the controlling agency about your problem, and we'll get back to you later. But you don't rush into talking. You focus on flying. Blue zone, you talk. Blue zone, you talk. Okay, you've got a flight attendant you want to talk to. You want to give her or him a NITS briefing, the nature of the problem, your intentions, your time, and any special procedures. These acronyms your instructor will show you all about. All right. I mentioned here also return the bank limit selector to auto. If returning, hold over the departure airport if you can. That's good airmanship. While you're on to one engine, you don't particularly want vectors to 20 miles, or it could be even more depending on traffic. Remember, you're not the only person in the sky. But you do have priority. And if I've lost an engine on a 737, I want to be over the airport holding. Why? If we had a problem with the other engine, at least you could dead stick it. Okay. You want to think smart. And that's not written in books. That's all part of what is called airmanship. So navigate, set up the holding pattern over VOR, and if there's no VOR, over the airport, hold over the airport and hold in present position. Use your FMC, CDU. Okay. Once you have set heading towards the holding, a quick review, a 5-second review or 10-second quick review. Did we do the right thing? Were recall items required? Yes. Did we do them? Yes. Okay, good. Because if you forgot to do any recall items, you want to get them done before you get to a checklist. That's why recall items are done first and checklists are done last. But in between the recall items done at 400 feet, minimum 400 feet, and the checklist, a lot has to happen in your thinking. You don't rush into checklists. You wait until you get the aviate, navigate, and communicate portion done. Then you do the first non-normal checklist, which in this case is checklist engine fire, engine severe damage, or separation. That's how it's called, and that's how it's called for. Then complete once that checklist is complete the after takeoff tag. Then complete other non-normal checklists. We'll talk about those in a second. The last non-normal checklist you're going to do is the one engine inoperative landing checklist, down to deferred items. Call for it that way, because you can't complete it until you set up the FMC for the approach, and also give the approach briefing. And if you're going en route and not returning, delay that one engine inoperative landing checklist until closer to your new destination airport or wherever you're going. And then once the approach has been set in the FMC, and once the approach briefing is complete, then the pilot flying can make the call, resume one engine inoperative landing checklist at deferred items. You want to stay professional in what you say so there's no confusion. You call everything the way it is in the QRH. All right. Now, a little review. The checklist to be completed, as we mentioned, the first one will be the engine severe damage or separation checklist. Then the after takeoff checklist. If you have separated engine number 1, you're going to have other checklists. The loss of system A. You don't have the system A hydraulics. The engine's gone. And on the hydraulic panel, you're only going to have one low pressure light on. The engine low pressure, the engine driven pump low pressure light will not be illuminated. Why? It's because the engine has left the airplane and the logic to the light has gone with it. So you have to think, when you look at that on the hydraulic panel, that really its 2 lights should be illuminated. You've lost all of system A hydraulics. Likewise for system B, except in the case of system B, or engine number 2, I should say, you have lost system B hydraulics, okay? Which is going to, and so that's going to be a checklist. And the alternate flap checklist. The other one up here for engine number 1 was loss of system A, and then the manual gear extension. So those 2 checklists. If it's engine number 2, loss of system B and alternate flap. Now, in case of loss of engine number 2 separated, you're not going to be able to get your leading edge flaps retracted. Ooh. So you have a maximum speed of 230 knots. Also a maximum altitude if you're going to another airport of flight level 200. Now your flaps are already extended. If you're coming back, that's a plus. They may not be at the setting that you want because you're going to end up wanting flaps 15, but at least using the alternate flap checklist, you can raise the flaps if you have to from what they were on takeoff, if they were greater than 15, which they shouldn't be greater than 15. But if you had to go en route, you can raise the trailing edge flaps, but not the leading edge flaps, slats. All right, you can't use the FMC for fuel flow. You've got to use your actual fuel flow. Okay, so unfortunately, Boeing don't have a section in the QRH under performance that gives you fuel flows with leading edge flaps extended. They do give you a little tip, is if you lost the number 1 engine and you're for whatever reason your gear is hanging, if you had to go around, let's say you your gear should come up after takeoff with the power transfer unit should bring the gear up. But I'm just saying now, one step forward, if you went around at an airport and you had to go around with one engine separated, you're not going to be able to get the gear up because you extended it manually. So What can you use for fuel flow if you have to go to an alternate? Well, you do have a checklist called or a reference in performance in the QRH with gear down. So Boeing do have those figures in the QRH. That's just something, just jumping ahead a little bit. If you had to go around in your gear, of course, you can't get your gear up if you lowered it with the manual gear extension. All right, so you've got a lot of considerations you have to discuss, and perhaps other checklists that you have to do. The one engine and operative landing checklist is the last one you call for, down to deferred items, then set up the FMC for the approach. Then the pilot flying does the approach briefing. And then the pilot flying can say something such as resume the one engine and operative landing checklist at deferred items. And in that case, you're actually doing the descent check, approach check, and landing check. Because remember, when you're reading that checklist, you read the normal checklists for the descent procedure, the approach procedure, and the landing procedure. They're all to be done from the non-normal checklist. Food for thought. So there we have it. There's a lot involved when you're flying with an engine separated. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this briefing. And if you want to contact me for a live briefing alone or with your partner, we can always do that. The information is on screen. I'll be doing several more of these briefings and including them in my package if you want to subscribe. We've got several briefings there now and many PowerPoints. This PowerPoint will all be included, in that package. Thank you for listening. And most important, stay professional, enjoy your flying, and stay passionate. Thank you.